Whether it's plentiful water, a clean atmosphere, or protected forests, around the globe we're facing a huge decline in the world's natural capital. Although we're increasingly aware of the part we play in this, many organizations don't realize the financial risk it poses to their operations and supply chains. So, what can be done? To prevent dangerous climate change, protect our natural resources, and minimize risk, accountability is paramount. In order to manage, we must measure. At CDP, we harness market forces to drive change by providing the only global system for the disclosure of environmental information. It helps to motivate thousands of companies and cities to measure, disclose, and manage environmental risks and opportunities. For companies and cities, CDP drives awareness of where to make strategic changes in order to increase efficiency, save money, and capitalize on commercial opportunities. It also builds competitive advantage and resilience. For investors and procurement teams, the information enables analysis of long-term risks and opportunities so that better investment decisions can be made. But it doesn't stop there. Policymakers and academics all benefit from these crucial insights. And it's working. Disclosing to CDP gave Walmart the insight to focus on reducing its refrigerant footprint after learning that it made up a larger percentage of the company's greenhouse gas emissions than its truck fleet. It helped Boeing to advance its strategies and set performance targets for carbon management. It even enabled Allergan to develop a 10-year vision to reduce water consumption by 50% by 2020. And they're not alone. Already 81% of the Global 500 report to us, informing investors with assets of $78 trillion. CDP is catalyzing change. Over the last 3 years, the number of Global 500 companies that have integrated climate change into their business strategy has jumped by over 60%. CDP data points are now downloaded on Bloomberg terminals an average of 1 million times every 6 weeks. And we've only just started.
Well, hello, good afternoon, and indeed good morning. Welcome to the CDP Global Water Forum for the first time by telepresence. I'm delighted and excited that we have a great range of speakers here to discuss one of the most critical issues facing the world today, which is investing in water security. Our experts are from Citigroup, Climate Change Capital, Deloitte, GE Ecomagination, Goldman Sachs, Norges Bank Investment Management, and Rockefeller & Co. So I'd like to begin by thanking our lead sponsors of CDP's water program, Deloitte and NBIM, and also Meet Me Communications, who have provided the facilities that allow us to communicate worldwide today, broadcasting on both sides of the Atlantic. We actually have more than 1,000 people watching us today from Europe, Africa, and all across the Americas. So welcome to all of you for what I think is going to be a very interesting couple of hours. I want to very particularly thank the stars of the show, in fact, ultimately, which are the corporations that have reported through CDP. It is very greatly appreciated on behalf of your shareholders and many other stakeholders. Now, the huge audience today is comprised of investors, corporations, policymakers, NGOs, and many other groups with an interest in this pressing issue, which represents a kind of really an opportunity. We want to devise today ideas that will drive change at scale, because that is what we really need, the scale required. Now, CDP started over 10 years ago as the Carbon Disclosure Project, but we've rebranded this year. And that's because we're now covering water and deforestation. In fact, around 80% of all the world's natural capital, becoming the only global system to measure, disclose, and manage environmental factors. I mean, the CDP water program itself has grown to such a degree, it's grown 60% this year, and we have 593 large companies reporting to investors and stakeholders through us. This is a huge exercise in corporate accountability. Today, CDP released our global water report for you to download free of charge from cdp.net, our website. And in there are lots of, there's the kind of case for solutions and examples of the solutions themselves, real-time solutions in water risk management. And please remember that the individual responses from the corporations are also available for you to download free of charge, so you can really dig into the detail. Now, we're going to hear from many experts on the panel discussion as we proceed over our time today. But I'm going to start off by inviting Dave Pearson, who is Global Leader of Sustainability at Deloitte Consulting, to begin to frame our debate today. Dave?
Thank you very much, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here today, and we are very proud at Deloitte of our relationship with the CDP Water Program and our participation with the Global Water Forum. We've been working with the CDP for 3 years and have seen an increasing level of awareness in water-related risks. And more importantly, we have seen an increase in actions to address these risks through innovation in technology and in partnerships. I'm not going to steal the thunder of my colleague Will Sarney, who will provide a more detailed update in a few minutes. But suffice to say, the feedback continues to provide insights into how all of us are addressing or not addressing our water challenges. The water questionnaire and survey is probably the most comprehensive in the world. It has scale in that it was sent to more than 1,000 of the world's largest corporations. It has focus, as it is focused on the corporations that have direct or indirect substantive water risks in their business. And we're able to identify notable trends from the survey every year. A few points that pulled out of this year is the investor interest in water is rising, with more than 530 institutional investors worth $57 trillion in assets being involved. Corporate purchasers are becoming increasingly more concerned about water. CDP issued the water questionnaire on behalf of 4 supply chain members who wish to use their purchasing power to apply positive pressure across their supply chains. And we've heard already of the 593 responses to date, which is the highest ever, a 59% increase over last year. We have a good program today, with Will setting the scene with an overview of the report, and he'll be followed by global representatives representing investors and companies committed to addressing water-related risks. And I cannot forget my friend Eric Rolston from Bloomberg, who will be hosting the panel. I now introduce you to Will Sarney, the Global Leader of Enterprise Water Strategy with Deloitte. Will is a noted author, advisor to our largest businesses in the world, and selfless in his commitment to addressing the water challenges we face today. Will?
Dave, thank you, and thank you everyone for participating in this event. So what I'd like to do is really provide just a brief overview of what we learned from this year's questionnaire responses. It'll set the stage for what I believe a very, very exciting conversation during our panel and some of the dialogues that you'll hear today. So I'll spend a few minutes, go through a few slides, and give you a feel for what we learned, our findings, conclusions, and some recommendations, which you should get a sense of from the title of the slide presentation. So with that, I'll just start to run through these rather briefly. So summary results, I'll touch on a few of the highlights here, talk about some of the sample findings, if you will, talk about the geographic differences in responses, some of the sector highlights, and then concluding remarks, which will really tie it back to the title of the report and the opening slide. So with that, these summary results and really just an overview here. So I think it was a great year in terms of what we learned and how companies are evolving in their evaluation of water risk and also business opportunities. So really some of the innovative technologies that are being developed along with new business models and partnerships, collective action. So again, this year, more than half the respondents experienced detrimental impacts related to water in the past 5 years. So that was 53%. More respondents this year identified water as a substantial risk to their business. It's 70%. That's very, very significant. More respondents identified water-related business opportunities. So we're seeing a balance now between the risk side of the equation, but also opportunities here. So water scarcity, water quality issues, driving technology innovation, and also collective action partnerships. Very, very exciting part of the story, in my view. Also, we're seeing that respondents are developing concrete targets and goals. That's increased. It's at 66%. Again, as the investor community and also multinationals understand water risk and identify how to perform against a set of strategies that they're developing. More respondents were able to identify supply chain risk at 77%. Again, very encouraging. Most companies recognize that their water footprint, their impacts, and their risk resides outside of their direct footprint. So looking at their upstream supply chain or downstream use in products also. So again, a really interesting evolution. And then water stewardship really is emerging as a very effective framework in not just managing risks, but also identifying business opportunities and collective action being a really key part of that. So very high level view of what we learned this year. Again, I encourage you to read the report. So if we move on to the next slide, really a few key takeaways here is that more and more companies are recognizing that there are water risks that they're exposed to. It's impacting their businesses, identified financial costs as high as $1 billion US. 64% of the companies reported risks either now or within the next 5 years. Again, this is a current business risk issue and business opportunity and projected out over the next several years. So very, very important. Near-term substantive risk increased by about 16%. So again, a real evolution in thinking around risk, how to quantify those risks and develop mitigation strategies. So moving on to the next slide, this is really key to one of our findings here. What we're finding is that 63% of the respondents set concrete goals or targets for direct operations. But if you think about water risk, it's typically outside your direct control. So that's really why we're pushing the framework of water stewardship as a way to identify risk, quantify risk, and identify business opportunities and drive innovation across a variety of industry sectors. So again, really interesting snapshot of where we're at, but also sets the stage for what we believe is a evolution in thinking around the movement from water management to water stewardship. So where does the push come from? So we absolutely believe that CDP, through their water program, plays a very important role. We've been in this for the past 3 years. We've seen really the impact that CDP has had in terms of education, awareness, upping the game, increasing the dialogue. Investors also have an absolutely key role to play along with NGOs, the public sector, and civil society. So again, this is really that notion of collective action. What are the levers? Who has a say in really driving us towards viable solutions? And again, new business opportunities for those companies that recognize the risk and can develop solution sets. So we talked a little bit about water stewardship. Again, just to reinforce the notion here, it's really a way to identify risk and opportunities. We tend to talk mostly about the risk side of the equation, but by developing a strategy, you can really engage with a wide range of stakeholders and get their ideas in terms of how to solve water-related risk issues related to scarcity and also quality. We believe it's a viable platform to manage impact and create value for companies and investors going forward. So a little bit about geographic specific findings. In some ways, no real surprises here. Response rates did increase. That's very, very encouraging, and we need to be mindful of that, except in North America and East Asia. So not sure that I can explain that. We can explain it. But nevertheless, we're seeing traction and adoption on a global basis. Quite a bit of traction in Europe around this issue of water scarcity and how it ties to resource scarcity in general. So encouraging results there. Move quickly over to sector highlights. Again, encourage people to take a look at the industry insight sections, not just your own industry sector, but look at what other sectors are doing around consumer staples, consumer discretionary sector, because there are best practices there that really can be carried over into other sectors such as energy and materials. So again, some really good case studies out there of companies that have really embraced water stewardship and using that as a platform to identify risk and mitigate opportunity and identify opportunities. So if you look at the left side of the slide, these are just a few of the sectors that identified a high percentage of exposure to substantive water risks. So we're seeing that in energy and materials in particular. And then to the right, these are the sectors that were impacted by water-related risks. So again, materials show up in either the 1 or 2 spot here. And there's an interesting story there, not just in terms of what the risks look like, but also how companies are quantifying that risk and really rolling that up to an enterprise understanding of how to mitigate that risk going forward. So just a few concluding remarks here. I think I have a few minutes. Really, the message that we're trying to get across here is that this is really well beyond water management. It's really about water stewardship. Collective action is key. So embracing your value chain, bringing those stakeholders into the conversation, including NGOs, civil society, public sectors, and so on. So really a key part of what we believe is a gap and the necessary step change that we hope to see over the next several months and several years. So those are the challenges. Another thing that we're really seeing is that companies are beginning to move away from just the price of water and beginning to think about the business value of water and using that as a basis for investments to mitigate that risk, but also make investments in technology innovations. So again, I encourage people to stop thinking about price, start thinking about value, and that'll catalyze change and accelerate change, we believe, in both the investor sector and also with multinationals. So corporate water stewardship, a key aspect of that. We also want to encourage people to think beyond social license to operate. Obviously very key, but we want people to think about essentially a license to grow. If you're looking at doubling your revenue globally, especially in emerging markets, think about how resources factor into that. And for most of the sectors represented here, water is a key input to their economic growth and also in the public sector. So, no water and you're basically not doing anything. So I think there's really a shift in thinking that we saw in this recent report. Again, very, very encouraging, not just in the percentage of respondents and what they're saying, but really this mind shift. So we believe CDP has a very, very critical role. We've seen that over the past 3 years. Really encouraged by what we're seeing in the investor community, really asking tough, demanding questions from a wide range of stakeholders as to how to quantify risk and how to mitigate that risk and how to communicate to stakeholders in a transparent manner. So that is a recap of the report. And with that, I'll turn it over to James Cameron, founder and chairman of Climate Change Capital.
Well, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Good morning, New York. My job now is to introduce the legendary Avi Cohen, Avi Joseph Cohen, who's a world-renowned investment strategist, a partner at Goldman's, president of the Global Markets Institute. I've known for some time now, Avi, that you've been following the climate change and sustainability, and now very particularly the water issue. And you and your team produced a really rather wonderful and very helpful report over the summer, which you call the Deep Dive Report. And you did, following on from Bill's remarks, you did identify the connection between water resources and growth. In fact, the constraint to growth. And I wonder if you could just, begin with a little explanation of that work and the surrounding research that you've done with your colleagues.
Well, let me begin, James, by thanking you for that lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be participating in today's session, representing not only my work, but the work of my other Goldman Sachs colleagues. Before I begin, I just want to make sure that I can be heard well.
Yes.
Somebody can acknowledge that. Perfect. The report that you refer to is something that is very much a macro analysis. We're looking at global economic trends, but also potential constraints to global economic growth, especially in the emerging world. Now, as was pointed out a little while ago, in the rest of the world, the non-developed world, water is used not so much for industrial purposes, but really for life. Agriculture, for example, is responsible for about 70% of water withdrawals, industrial purposes, about 20%. And so we took a look at the emerging world primarily, and what we found is that there are some very serious concerns. While in the developed world, there has been increased attention to water stewardship, using water resources properly, keeping the water clean, reusing wastewater, and so on, preciously little effort has been made thus far in the emerging world. And one of our conclusions has been that this could, in fact, be a constraint on economic growth, particularly in places like China and India. Here in North America and in parts of Europe, we are water rich. Not only do we have a lot of water, we have a great deal of water per capita. That is certainly not the case in many other nations. We tend to think of the arid Middle East, but we can also look at a number of other nations, including India, where there's dramatically less water. Even China, which does have a lot of water, on a per capita basis, has only about a quarter as much as the United States. So these are significant issues. The other thing that I hasten to add is that our work has been primarily on the macro side, that is from my portion of investment research at Goldman Sachs, but we have many other analysts who are looking at the company-specific impact of water, and this, of course, does focus more on the developed economies, the developed markets, and are very much in the wheelhouse of what CDP is trying to accomplish.
Yes, perhaps we could develop that a bit further, Abby, that it's clear that your work identified macroeconomic risks at a country level and identified also risks associated with significant global trade patterns, including this vital point about per capita water abstractions and the need to bear that in mind with open trade systems. But equally, the constraint to growth is a phenomenon that affects individual companies, and there are risks there for companies that have to be absorbed and managed. Perhaps you could just develop this further with some of the work on individual corporations, maybe even extending into the debate that we've had in the carbon field over potentially stranded assets that looked like they were worth something but turned out to be worth less because of failure to access vital resources like water.
Again, this would come under the area of responsibility of my colleagues in the research department, who are industry experts and experts on specific companies. But let me give you a few examples. I'll give you an international one. There's a great deal of discussion about economic growth in China, and our work and the work of several NGOs indicates that the resources in northern China may simply not be accessible for the companies that do business there. So, for example, it was somewhat shocking to find out that only about 20% of the water in the northern provinces can be used for agricultural or consumption purposes. 50% of the water isn't even clean enough to be used for industrial purposes. And so what we see in many of the emerging economies has been such a rush towards economic development. It's been done without the safeguards that we, in some cases, take for granted in the United States, other parts of the Americas, and of course, in Europe. When we take a look at companies that are doing it well, we have a focus, at least in my area, on U.S.-based companies, but of course they're not doing all their business in the U.S. The S&P 500 derives, depending upon the quarter, 40 to 45% of its revenues from its operations outside the United States. And what we do know is that a whole host of companies are really focused in on this issue. A few years ago, if we had asked our analysts to think about water, they of course would have spoken to us about some of the food companies, the beverage companies, and so on. But it has become much more complex than that, much more sophisticated in the analysis, with a careful review of supply chains, for example, and also the ability to appropriately discharge wastewater in a way that is not damaging to the environment. Perhaps one industry of great interest, of course, is energy. There's no place along that energy supply chain that is not highly dependent upon water. We see it in terms of the mining of the resource, the processing of the resource, and the generation of the electricity itself, particularly in thermoelectric kinds of plants. And here it is a very significant issue. In the United States, regulations have been in place for quite a while, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we've done enough in that regard. But again, let me give you an example of some place where the full impact has not yet been fully seen. We talk a lot about the energy revolution underway now in the United States, the ability to use fracking as one technology to extract from the earth various forms of natural gas and so on. And as we take a look around the world, we see that there's enthusiasm for applying these sorts of techniques to shale deposits and similar resources in places like China and Mexico. However, China and Mexico don't have water in the areas where they have these resources in the ground. And so we look at this, as I mentioned earlier, starting at the macro country level, take it down to the sector level, and of course my colleagues who specialize in individual industries and companies would take it down even further in terms of what the potential investment implications may be. As a firm, we're very concerned not just on the portfolio implications, but also in terms of how we advise our corporate clients. More than a decade ago, we became very involved with CDP in terms of carbon footprint, other things having to do with greenhouse gases and so on. And so we've worked with our corporate clients in terms of how they can best be good corporate citizens. And we think that water is indeed the next frontier. Our clients are looking for advice in that regard.
So one of the things that interests us, and certainly we hope CDP can help with providing better quality data to decision makers in the investment world, is how do they make different decisions based upon better understanding of this vital resource. You highlighted the energy sector. It's very rare to have reports published on risk associated with the mining stock because it fails to access water, or that the water resource that they depend upon is somehow factored into their valuation. How do we address that? I mean, what else do we need to do in order to get this message through, and who do we need to speak to?
Well, we are, of course, a financial intermediary. We sit between investors and companies. We sit basically in the center of capital flows. And one of the things we're supposed to do as intermediaries is to provide as much information as we can, as much information as we can derive, so that thoughtful and appropriate decisions can be made. And as part of that, we have a research process where we look at what we call sustained factors. Not surprisingly, that acronym relates to a whole host of things related to sustainability. And we are looking at issues that would normally be so-called ESG, environmental, societal, and governance issues, but we're also looking at the other factors that we think could either impede or enhance the long-term viability and success of the company. By doing it in that way, by incorporating it into our ongoing investment process, we haven't shunted it aside where we have 2 or 3 people who specialize in this category. Rather, we expect all of our analysts for all industries in all countries to look at factors, including carbon footprint. We have asked them to look at water increasingly, and a whole host of related factors.
So one of the sectors which clearly and obviously affected, and you picked it up in your global analysis, is agriculture. And the global commodity trade operates every day with very, very large volumes of transactions, but with not only no price for water to work with, certainly no global price, but no proxy either to help them understand what might be lying behind not just the soft commodities either, the hard commodities that get traded on their screens. I've said before in various events that I think someone will win a Nobel Prize for trying to figure out how to do this to better inform the markets. But do you have any thoughts, Avi, about how would we start the process for better understanding the true cost of this underlying resource in commodity markets?
James, not surprisingly, you've asked a very important question, and one that, for me, at this point, is almost impossible to answer. But even so, I'll take a stab at it.
Good
and
on
I'll
you.
be saying that many years ago, many economists, theoretical and otherwise, thought it would be fairly simple to price carbon. And what we found is, well, we could have put a price on it, but it wasn't really the right price. And I think that having been burned by that experience over the last 2 decades, many in the financial markets are a little bit wary about thinking that we can be so clever as to figure out what the right pricing is. That doesn't mean it's not important. It is important. And being a practical person, we try to come at it in different ways. And one way, of course, is to look at what's happening with regard to virtual water trade, which is becoming incredibly important. What is virtual water trade? Well, there are commodities that are very water intensive that do get traded and have been traded much more actively in recent years, in part because of the recognition that water is such a crucial element. One great example has been the end of the project in the Middle East on the part of Saudi Arabia and other countries to become self-sustaining in things like wheat production, which was in some ways not realistic. So what we can see is that as they give up on the idea of marshaling enough water so they can do this, instead importing the product that is water intensive. The other great example, I think, is China. China, as mentioned before, does have water, maybe not as much as it would like on a per capita basis, but it does have an enormous problem in terms of wastewater treatment, the quality of water, and of course, as is true in many countries, the distribution of water. And so they are having significant problems in terms of generating not just the crops they need, but now, of course, the protein that their ever-enlarging middle class is demanding. And so we saw yet another form of virtual water trade in terms of huge step up with regard to the importation of protein into China. They have long been significant importers of soybeans, not just from North America, United States, Canada, and so on, but also Brazil. And now they are very interested in importing meat product, including pork. Over the last 20 years or so, the per capita consumption of pork has doubled in China, and it is not as resource intensive as beef would be, but it certainly is more water intensive than some of the grains and so on that it's replacing. So when we take a look at how do you price water, it's going to be an issue that the investment theorists are going to have to deal with, and having had the uncomfortable experience with carbon, maybe investors and corporations will be a little bit wary. But even so, we see that there are these other activities which have increased tremendously with regard to what I would refer to as international water trade?
I certainly see good sense in underemphasizing global prices for water and emphasizing more strongly value to enterprises for their growth, as Bill was saying, but also value to an economy and having access to traded goods in open markets that come from places that are rich in water. And you could see that in many instances you've identified, but even in the trade in milk products from New Zealand to China would be another one worth noting. But it's also the case that we do have to find a way of valuing these resources systematically so that we make decisions every day that are bit by bit more rational, and we don't finish up depleting our resources and impoverishing ourselves. I wonder whether or not you have any suggestions about how we and in CDP and others could improve the quality and the relevance of the data to make decisions that you as an intermediary could assist with in connecting your clients with these, essentially making better decisions with better quality data.
Well, as a preface, let me remind everybody that water is in many ways a local commodity, not a global commodity. And so when we do see this step up in virtual global trade of water, that is something that could be quite helpful because it helps smooth out some of the distribution issues. And those countries that are able to produce water, have it available, and good quality water, we're finding ways to distribute it to other parts of the world. That's something that is fairly new. The other thing we have to recognize is that unlike energy markets, which have been priced globally for a long time, water markets not so much, particularly since in many places as well, there have been subsidies on the pricing of water, which works against incentives to save the water and to use it appropriately. So, for example, if the price being paid for agricultural purposes is too low in a particular country, that water may not be used as efficiently as it might be. Perhaps it'll be flood irrigation rather than drip irrigation, where a lot of the water is lost. Maybe it won't be careful retention of the wastewater and processing it and so on. And so we're dealing with a situation in which the pricing on the ground in different countries, and in fact in different communities in different countries, is really quite different. And so from a macro perspective, that is, these are vexing issues. You asked a very specific question about what do we need as investors. And there, I'll put a different hat on. Instead of thinking in terms of economic development and the broad macro picture, I'll put the portfolio manager hat on and basically say that as an investor, the information I would like to see is information that supports the idea that a particular company, number one, has access to the water that it needs, number two, is efficient in the use of that water, and number three, obviously these are broad categories and we all know there are many variables under it, but number three is careful in the use of that water. We also have to distinguish between water withdrawal and water consumption. There are some industries that need a lot of water, but they return a lot of that water as well. And we really need to be encouraging processes which might be water intensive that are also water careful, so that we're not losing the ongoing use of that precious resource.
I mean, those are fantastic suggestions, and no doubt will be noted by our substantial audience. Let me try and bring this to a conclusion and give you some time to sum up yourself. We've discussed how we might better inform the markets. We've discussed how we can make macroeconomics touch on corporate performance too, particularly looking at the two different types of growth. You've made some suggestions about the sort of metrics that we might need to develop in order to make more accurate judgments about who's performing well against some standards. We've even touched upon, although not explicitly, the notion of natural capital lying behind good conservation of water, which might be a a fertile ground for further conversation. How would you like to sum up the work that you've done with your colleagues in this area and the conversation that we are in with all these people online listening to?
Well, let me begin with some of the micro or company-specific aspects. One of the things we discovered before the financial crisis was that companies that really did pay attention to environmental issues, and at that point the focus was much more on energy efficiency and carbon footprint, we found that they were indeed rewarded, often with higher PE ratios than other companies in the same industry or lower cost of debt capital. We saw that that was true in some industries in the United States. We found it in different places in Europe. We found it in Australia. And so when we think about these issues, it's not just doing the right thing. It's being recognized by investors because they're saving money, they're doing the right thing for their communities, and ultimately the cost of doing the right thing is properly reflected. We make a mistake, for example, when we look only at the direct cost of something rather than all of the indirect costs. And we need to price that in properly for water, just the way we're now trying to do for energy. The second summation comment that I would make has to do with the broader macro picture, not as an investor, but really as somebody concerned about economic development around the world. We learned many lessons in developed countries in terms of using our resources properly, not wasting them, husbanding them, not just for ourselves, but for the next generation. And one of the important things will be to share what we know from a technology standpoint, but also from a policy standpoint in these advanced emerging economies. This is where the global population growth is. And if the numbers that we've seen are correct, within a decade, 40% of the global population will be living in areas that are water scarce. That is not an acceptable situation.
Well, thank you very much, Abby. It was tremendous, really good to talk to you. And I hope you'll stay together with the conversation as it unfolds. Thank you very much, Abby. And now it's my duty to introduce Eric Roston from Bloomberg. Eric is editor of Bloomberg Sustainability News website. He's also the author of a critically acclaimed book, The Carbon Age, How Life's Core Element Has Become Civilization's Greatest Threat. Eric, you have the floor. Over to you.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today and to introduce our guests on this panel to talk about the fourth CDP water report. We have, it's blanking, awesome, good start. Cut, can we take two? Thank you. Dean Dre, Global Industrial Sector Research Leader at Citigroup. Will Sarney, Director at Deloitte Consulting in charge of Global Water Strategy. William Ambrose, Global Head of Business Risk at Norges Bank Investment Management. And Joyce Habucha, Managing Director and Director of Sustainability and Impact Investments at Rockefeller and Company. There's a couple neat things about this discussion today. One of them, I think, is there's this line on page 20 of the CDP water report. It's in the statement by Calvert. It's just a plain statement, and they just say, drop this in about halfway through. Arguably, investors have a significant influence on the economy, and as a result, they can drive positive change. I think there's very few people that would dispute that, so we could probably say that's inarguable. But it's sort of a neat index of what's going on within the last 5 or 10 years, and within the last 2 weeks, as we see projects like the Carbon Tracker Initiative tried to channel the voice of investors the way CDP has been doing that for carbon and now water, and there are other initiatives for the last few years. The other thing that I think is really neat about this event today is I think we're all learning here, and this may not be true for those of you viewing, that a television set is sort of like the 21st century in that it's very hot, a little bit crowded, and we don't have enough water. But at least it's half full. So having pointed that out, here's the title for the report, Moving Beyond Business as Usual, a Need for a Step Change in Water Risk Management. The phrase water risk management sort of implies water risk.
And like, there's a lot of people in the room today, but there's a lot of people who aren't in the room. And who might not know or might easily dismiss water risk. So just for starters, what are we talking about and how do we know it's real? And I'll just open it up to whoever wants to jump in.
Well, I'll be happy to start, and thank you first for inviting me, and congratulations on producing the new report on water. So very well done. I know it's a lot of hard work, so I'm sure you're all happy to be done with that. So at MBIM, we see water scarcity as a part of a wider risk picture, and we think of it this is a long-term challenge. Although it happens every day that there will be companies in different locations which have challenges related to water. We invest for the long term. We safeguard these assets and build wealth for future generations. So this is truly a long-term issue. We think of this in the short term, medium term, and way beyond 10 years as well. Now, in our responsible investment framework, we think about that this is multiple levels. So we care about what's going on at country levels. So, we talked about China, we talked about India. We take a look at that. We care about sectors. So what goes on in mining versus utilities versus insurance. The challenges are very different. And we also relate to, obviously, company level. As a part of our responsible investment perspective, we don't only talk about environmental concerns. We like to think of also how markets function. So we invest in markets. So how do they function across time? As an investor, we care about corporate governance, so the framework around investment. And also, as an investor, we care about what we're exposed to through our investments, whether that be conflict, it be human rights, it can be different kind of environmental issues. And within that, we see water as a very important part of that.
Sorry, Dad.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Let's mix it up a little bit. Will, you want to jump in?
Sure. I want to go back to your sort of the key part of your question. Is it real? Well, yeah, water risk, of course, is real, because companies responding to CDP and those companies that didn't respond to CDP are talking about business risk, business continuity, stranded assets potentially, around fundamentally three dimensions. Physical scarcity. Do you have enough water when you need it, where you need it, of the right quality? What are the regulatory risks that are evolving because of these physical and quality issues? And then, in my view, probably the most difficult to quantify but most impactful, because it's like an on-off switch, is reputational risk. So if those stakeholders that know about your operation don't like how you're managing water, they can shut you down. So in the report, there are real examples of business disruption, quantifying that risk factor. So, absolutely positively real.
I think we need detail. Like, when we talk about water risk, people need to know, like, is like a meteorite going to hit the Great Lakes? Like, what's the actual thing that could go wrong here to a business? So, like, the report shouts out Israeli chemicals, which like is dependent on resources in the Dead Sea, which is dropping by a meter a year. Like, what are and the report says, I think, there's like an average of 7 risks for every company. What are those risks?
I'll jump in here. So first, I'd like to thank CDP for the opportunity to present. I wear a number of hats here in the water sector, and just to dovetail on what Abby had to say, she made reference to sector analysts. So that's one of my day jobs. So at Citi, I'm the lead analyst for the multi-industry electrical equipment group. Half of the companies I follow provide equipment and services into the water sector. So they're part of the solutions to these risks. Also, I serve on the advisory board to the UN and have been in contact with CDP through presentations at World Water Week. And we're beginning to see companies being held accountable on elements like water footprint, making companies more transparent in terms of how much water they use. And very specifically, one of the risks that you talk about, make it tangible. In 2004, not to pick on India so much, but Coca-Cola had to shut down one of their plants because they no longer had access to a reliable source of safe water. That's a risk. It came up very quickly, and it was it's a risk that continues to be very acute in these spaces. Pharmaceutical companies use ultra pure water. They have to treat that in order to get it to that stage, but they start with raw water and if it's going to be in China, it's got to come from sources that will most likely be surface water. Almost 60% of China's surface water is polluted. So you're seeing companies that can't grow in developing markets. That was something that Abby had said. We're seeing that every day.
You know, to add to this, I think one of my favorite examples comes in 2003 in France, when there was a huge heat wave, and the nuclear plants could not function because there wasn't enough water. And so, you know, it all kind of really basically ties in to each other. But I think, you know, just to kind of bring it back to both of your earlier questions, what, you know, the importance of investors and why now. And I think the whole point is that this is it's an evolving, you know, we're evolving in our awareness. And you see it obviously the most in the developing countries, where for years they just thought water is free and we don't need to take care of it. The reality is that happens to us also. Yes, we have been much more. And so as investors, we have a role to play in order to really ask the questions of the companies.
Yeah. Well, since you brought up France, Western Europe in 2003, that's actually one of the events that, you know, the scientists have gone back and statistically linked it to climate change. And so we should just kind of put that on the table and evaluate it. I've heard some people, argue quite confidently that the carbon problem and the water problem are very similar, and that having sort of cut our teeth, you know, to put a positive spin on what Abby Joseph Cohen was talking about on water, and carbon, maybe we learned some things. So, like, how similar are climate and water? If climate is driving the hydrological cycle, then aren't they the same thing?
Oh.
Okay.
After you.
Okay.
I think I follow you.
Yeah. Well,
so
I think it's yes, they are linked, but I think it's useful also to think of them as two separate issues. Climate change is something which we think about in a very long-term perspective. Water is also one of those things, but there are demographical developments, which means that irrespective of climate change, assume for a moment there was no climate change, there will be challenges.
Many people, you know, and
that's fine. Yeah. And there would still be challenges related to scarcity of water. We know today there will be metals and mineral mines in mountains where there's not sufficient water. So what happens? There's desalination of seawater, and you have to pump water up into the mountains. That's a real cost.
And it sounds like it takes a lot of energy to do that as well.
A lot of energy, and of course the desalination site is not cheap either. So these are real issues, and they are today. But I'm sure there is a link, yes, with global warming. But I think it's useful to also remember that they are separate issues.
Desalination we should come back to, but will you?
So I feel strongly and passionately, as you might imagine, that water is not carbon. And if we start thinking about water as carbon, I am absolutely convinced we're headed in the wrong direction in terms of solutions. So carbon's fungible, water is not. There's no replacement for water. We can engage in a number of different sources of energy. We can't do that with water, really. So water's a local issue. Also,
couldn't we substitute water with fruity, high-sugar juice drinks?
We could. Well, you know, I'm not going to go there. But
You're welcome.
I mean, you can use air in place of water for clean-in-place activities in the beverage sector, potentially for fracking, shale, things like that. So there is potential, but fundamentally, no replacement for water, and it has dimensions that energy and carbon do not. It has environmental, economic, social, and spiritual dimensions. So there are values associated with water that make it a very, very complex, but in some ways unifying resource.
I'm going to just add one more element to that. When you're listing all of those, I'll also add political aspects. In the world, there are 240 different water basins that are shared across multiple countries. And that is becoming very acute, and there's expectations that you'll see more conflict between countries and regions over water because of shared boundaries and what's drinking water is coming for one country is coming in from another.
I agree, and I would like to really emphasize the point that Will has made, because I've been saying that also. We can find new ways of creating energy. We don't have any replacement for water, and so even though they are linked in that climate change makes the water risk higher, but the water risk is there no matter what. And the other piece, which I think everybody's made, but I think is worth making again, is that it's a shared resource, and it has a lot more. It's much more immediate because of its social implications.
One question I had was, so that's geographically shared resources, but what about like money flows? Like, how much is do you think there will be receptiveness, around the world to every country in the world investing in every other country in the world to gather water resources?
I think you're seeing that now. So, to Abby's point earlier when she was talking about virtual water, that is a fascinating development in the world of water, that you're importing and exporting water through goods. Just, this has a water footprint, just like...
It's like when Americans buy blueberries in January, they're buying Argentinian water.
Exactly. Yeah. So, that's really what's happening. So yeah, you're seeing investments in different parts of the world driven by that need for water.
I think it's worth noting that water is a huge business, and as Dave touched on, his companies he covers typically produce products and solutions for water. So it's not only the products that we consume, but it's also a global business in as much as finding better solutions, more efficient solutions in industry.
You had mentioned desalination. So if you think about what are the solutions and what are the commercial opportunities for companies to get more reliable access to fresh water, in the past couple of years, let's say the past 10 years, reverse osmosis forms of desalination and the efficiencies that have been created because of energy recovery devices have made it far more economic to create fresh water from salt water. But on the same token, also water reuse has come on very strong, and you're seeing it legislated where more communities need to be doing that.
Mm-hmm. I suggest one other thing when we're thinking about water. The notion of a negawatt, so basically using conservation as a way to not make those big capital investments. We're seeing the same dialogue showing up in the water world around the negadrop. So can you drive efficiency and conservation so you're not placing big bets on capital investments everywhere as the solution set, only where you really need it. Mm-hmm. So I think we're getting pretty creative.
Like who? Is there an example? You've written about this a little bit.
The state of California, I think, does a good job in terms of linking energy, carbon, water across all of their economic sectors and really thinking about it holistically. And there are actually some company examples where they're doing the same thing. So they'll map water according to scope 1, 2, and 3, thinking about it in a very holistic manner and really driving efficiency wherever they can.
One sort of practical thing, I think, sort of coming off of that is it would be, I think, useful for everybody sort of watching to get inside the mind of an investor, and a lot of times these conversations can get sort of high level and vague, but as investors, how do you what is your decision making process for incorporating this risk into the big picture? Are there steps?
Yeah. I think that's a very, very important question. And in fact, I was thinking we were talking at the macro. We need to really kind of get to the micro, and in that way, one of the things that's really is going to be very useful is the work that CDP is doing, and because the first thing to do is for us as investors to first acknowledge that water is a risk, and then to begin to map it. In terms of the company and in terms of understanding it. So we need to understand it as investors, just like the companies need to understand it as companies, and then make so that we understand what the companies are what the companies are doing. And we have a set of risks and a set of questions we ask at Rockefeller and Company in terms of identifying what companies in what sectors have risks, what the risks are, and then what are the solutions, and it really is about water stewardship, because we think that part of the risk is a community risk, not just how much water use water do you use. And so love the graph that shows we are using less water, but it doesn't really actually take the whole thing into consideration. And it's always a question of asking the right questions. So it takes us to
asking questions. Sort of is what you do when there aren't numbers you can look at. To some extent, are there numbers you can look at and
can I disagree on that? I think asking questions and the right questions is what investors do, no matter what. Even when there are numbers to look at, you need to ask the questions to get the real story behind the numbers. Because if you just look at the number, so I think that asking questions about process is very important.
So are some of these fuzzy ESG factors, are they better because there aren't numbers involved? Cut out the middleman?
No, they're not. You're putting words in my mouth. That's
Okay. Which means you're doing a great job. Right?
No, I think that there are two pieces. There is a process and number. And I think that as investors, whatever we do, whether it is fuzzy ESG, which is not necessarily fuzzy, and whether it is a financial process, as a financial analyst, if you just take the numbers and you don't understand what's going on behind it, you're going to be in trouble. I think that if you're looking at the sustainability issues, which now have business things, you need to understand the process. And sometimes if there isn't a good number, then the process itself helps you. But that's the point, is that as investors, we need data, we need information, we need comparable information, and we need to understand what's happening in sectors. And in those fuzzy things, they're fuzzy because we don't yet have enough good information.
I do regret fuzzy.
And I would also disagree with you on that and defend Joyce's position in that you can have companies reporting on great efficiency, conservation measures, reuse, recycling, but if there is no engagement with stakeholders across the value chain and a level of transparency, then there's risk exposure. And the numbers don't give you the whole story. They're very, very important. They're quantifiable, but hardly a risk management strategy.
I'd like to interject, not to give my point, but I want to hear more from William, because I've been in front of William in meetings because he's a client, and to hear him go through his thought process as a risk management from the water side. So,
well, I think it's useful also to think about that. These challenges also represent opportunities. So you cannot forget that this is a huge business. And as an investor, we want to tap into that. So we want to know, and we want to create value for our part of the situation. But then in a risk perspective, we think of it in many dimensions. We actually developed our own set of expectations, 2 companies, which we share with them, and we say that this is what we expect the board of the company to ensure is in place. We want you to have a proper process around it. And to support that, we've been a founding sponsor of CDP since 2009. We also have our own program where we complement the CDP water report for our own purposes, where we measure and look at companies and see what their kind of transparency and policy level is. But it's important to recognize that that's not an end in its own it's not an objective in its own right. It's just really a proxy for the actual process going on at companies. So when we work with companies, what we want to do is that we want to support them in their long-term investment programs to have really good solutions. We want them to recognize the challenges, and we want them to address them. Joyce mentioned previously the importance of getting more information. I think that is, from my perspective, extremely important. We want to have information not only at the company level of policy and that kind of information. We actually want to go beyond that. We want to be able to have information about where sites are located. We want to be able to understand the longevity of the sources and the types of sources. We want to be able to understand how this rolls up to company level. You can come up with average values, which are useful, but they might actually be.
I'm curious about that because water is, as you've said, is such a local thing. Like, so I think Abby mentioned, Europe's water problem, but like, does the UK have a different water problem than Europe does? It's, big island. So like, I guess what are the limits of having an average understanding of like a company's water risk?
Well, if you just take an example of just select any mining company you want on listed in London, what you will probably find is that most of the mines are somewhere else. So yes, it's a UK listed company, but the mining might be going on somewhere else. The other thing you'll find is that if they have, say, 20 mines across the globe, you will probably find that the issues they're facing, whether it's related to human rights, conflict, labor, environment, and so on, differ from site to site. So you might be able to come up with an average value, which is, wow, this looks fine. It just happens to be that one of the sites is in the desert and the other one is in the rainforest. So you come up with some average issue, which doesn't really help you make a good and accurate decision. And for us, we want to see that site level information, because when we see it at a portfolio level, it might be a very different outcome to what we see when we invest and analyze in individual companies.
Just to show you how close we're getting to have those measures of efficiency. So oil refiners, for every unit of gasoline, it typically takes 12 units of water. And to have a metric, and the refiners are now beginning to report their water efficiency, to be able to see who is most efficient, broadly as a corporation, starts the process where you can see who's the best in terms of that efficiency, but then take it down to the site level, which William is asking about. The idea of, okay, where are you going to locate that? But you start with the ability to report that efficiency per unit of production.
Mm-hmm. And then I think it's important that you really do need to overlay this with accurate and good information about water scarcity and sources and the longevity, so that you can really bring it together and say, well, these sites, which you might have a broad portfolio, but where their mines are across companies, concentrated the regions where there's a water issue. Then it really starts making sense to be able to analyze this.
And when you get to that, one of the important pieces, and I think that's always the surprise, is that there are a lot of industries nobody thinks of as being water intensive, and then they turn out to be water intensive. I always think of the garment industry, because people don't think that the clothes you wear are water intensive, but the cotton, the processes are very, very water intensive. And again, you need to know exactly what they're using and and all of these other pieces. So, and that's why I want to put in a plug-in again for the CDP report. It's terrific because that report has really identified by sectors where some of the issues are. And Will had talked about the statistic that 77% of the companies know where the risks are in their supply chain. But let's remember that it is still a very small sample of companies that have responded, and 33% are admitting that they didn't know where the risks were in their supply chain. And so the next step for them, obviously, is, having gotten the question, is now they're going to go and look for them. And we are going to get more and more and better information over time. So.
Can I just throw one thing in? I think we're sort of touching on this a little bit, but you brought up the issue of water scarcity maps and overlaying your value chain, your supply chain operations and your current customers, consumers, and where you might go ultimately. I think the goal here is for companies to be able to operate in those red areas of the map and have the social license to operate and the license to grow through things like efficiency, alternative uses of water, and so on. So, it's not like there's going to be this mass exodus from regions that are red or projected to be red the sweet spot is, how do you really operate in those areas effectively as a business and serve the growing middle class?
That's right. And if you take your point, plus you take what Abby was saying, and we're going to begin to export water from regions who are goods, from regions who have less water constraints, then actually these should not become red, because if they don't do it correctly, and that's why the whole idea of water stewardship becomes extremely important, and the fact that it is a community resource and you have to have collective action. Because if I begin to grow beef, if you want, and then use my water to export it to China, but everybody else begins to suffer, we're going to have a problem. So we need to think about it, and the companies need to think about it carefully.
It's probably worth, since we sort of started looking at specific risks, like looking at specific solutions and technologies, and here it's also like risk. It's like, what exactly are you talking about? Yeah, there's like neat examples. There's like the iconic, Roof of the Rouge plant and Ford's plant. There's a neat example, the report of, I guess there's an EMC has a rain catchment in North Carolina. But like, those are cool and inventive, but like, how scalable are things like that? And
as long as you don't, as long as you're in compliance with water law, which varies quite a bit in the US, then some of those technology solutions work really well. And in some cases, those technology solutions push changes in public policy. So long answer, but yes, of course, they're scalable. But one of the things we talked about before the panel was, how does public policy play into this and the importance of it? Well, it evolves as technology evolves.
Just to put an exclamation point on that reference about difference in laws. In the US, if a company tried to put that cistern west of the Mississippi, it would be illegal, because of water rights. Every drop of water is actually owned by someone who may be very separate from who the landowner is. And so it just dramatizes the point that once you start peeling the onion, you'll see that there are complexities both on the legal side, regulatory side, as well as on the government side.
Joyce?
Yeah, no.
Oh, okay.
I did not know about that, and I was thinking about how important that is.
So there's only one other country that has water rights that trade separately from the land rights. It's Australia. And there's from an investment standpoint, there's a whole subsector of traded water rights that are land-based. All of the fracking being done in Colorado is all being funded through water rights. And some of the farmers are just losing out because the guys that want to do the frack drilling are paying much higher than the farmers.
The American West is a fascinating study right now in terms of public policy issues, technology developments, exciting place for innovation.
Let's, let's run through, so I don't know how much time we have left. Let's just, regardless of topic, let's run through some interesting case studies. Like, what are your favorite just examples of like good management or risk awareness or whatever it is? Just like whether it's a nation, a city, is always some reticence to talk about specific companies, but who's on top here?
I've got one I'm dying to talk about. Just what you said about a nation or country. A best example is Singapore. So what I always like to point out is Singapore has no sources of natural water. There's not a river, a brook, a swamp. You can drill down. All you're going to get is seawater and rocks. Technically, no one should ever live there. So they've subsisted on piping water in from Malaysia, and then several years ago built desalination plants. And since then, there's an entire effort to reuse water. And if you come in from the airport now, there's a lake. That lake is entirely what they call new water. So if there's a terrific example of a very forward-thinking country, city-state, it's Singapore in terms of how they...
I thought Abby and Will and Joyce were talking about how there's no such thing as new water.
Well,
They call it the water.
It's brilliant in that they're branding it. You know, it is taking wastewater and turning it into potable water, which is again really where we're going to have to go with all of this, and get as much out of each drop.
And instead of calling it reused water, they're calling it new water, which is actually wonderful because people are willing to drink it, right?
Mm-hmm.
While if you say we're doing reused water, they may not be able to.
Pre-owned to take the
that's right.
model from used cars.
Yeah,
like
pre-owned
cars.
water.
I think it's also just to sort of add a bit as well. I think it's water scarcity is not something which turned up like the day before yesterday. It's been something which has been a part of agriculture for actually thousands of years. So in agriculture, water irrigation is something which has been and continues to be impressive. And I think also there are multiple industries. If it's hydropower, where the management of water within dams is extremely advanced. Pricing of water within dams is extremely advanced. So there's a lot of sectors which do this very, very well. And I think scarcity is also one of those things which drives imagination, it drives technology. And actually, I would think, so Singapore, an excellent example of that. I would think if you go to places where they have a lot of water, you probably find that they have the worst management of water because it's for free.
Mm-hmm.
So I just happen to be where I live. We have plenty of water. So I'm sure the municipality will be very proud to talk about all the good things they do. But I'm sure there are also things which has to do with transportation of water where there are challenges, for instance.
And I was born in Egypt, and one of the very first things you learn as a school kid is about how the innovation of irrigation and how they finally got
the river,
because there is no water. There is a very narrow river Nile, and then you don't get a lot of irrigation, so a lot of water, and you don't get much rain. Nobody owns a raincoat used to own a raincoat in Egypt. You could tell it. You could tell a tourist because they were wearing raincoats.
Interesting. I wanted to, Will, you had a slide, sectors most sensitive to water risk. There was energy and materials and something else, but agriculture was not on it. So I was trying to reconcile agriculture using 70% of the water, but that not showing up in the response data.
Sure. So, ag is not broken out as a separate entity, but it's embedded into, obviously consumer products, apparel, food and beverage, and so on. So that's the big push to stewardship. Think about your supply chain and how that factors into it. So it's absolutely a key component to a number of the sectors.
Okay. What about, let's see. We've covered a lot of ground, so much so that you'll give me a second. Maybe, it might be fun just to elaborate. And Joyce, you mentioned about your personal experience and what it was like growing up in a place that was where you had consciousness of how little water. And, there's just a tendency because, and it's a good thing, that we're all sort of socialized to not think about our personal experiences and what we do for a living. That's generally, I think, extremely useful. But with something like water, we're just kind of sitting on the table as we're trying to get our heads around this global thing. How does your personal experience, I ask people out, why do you do what you do? Why are all of you in water and not professional bowlers?
You haven't seen us bowl, that's why.
Right.
But
you don't know who's a football player.
We all do this, and so one way or another, we're all invested in not a financial way in it, even if we're invested in a financial way in it. Any thoughts?
Happy to go. I think I mentioned to you, I started my career as a hydrogeologist, so groundwater guy. Putting in municipal water wells, putting in wells for industry, and my solution always was just go find more water. Well, my career has come full circle, and I spent all of my time focused on water and recognized that that is a very small tool in the toolbox. So for me, it's very personal. It's connecting to kind of how I grew up.
From an investment standpoint, again, my day job is to follow a sector of industrial companies that provide equipment and services, everything from pumps, valves, water test, and as at one of the end markets, I needed to be proficient at what all the mega issues are. 2 weeks ago, I was in Thailand with a group of investors looking at what was the largest waste or drinking water treatment facility in all of Asia. It's bigger than the New York City municipal plant. And to see all the technology that they're using in order to comply with their standards. So it's part of what I have to do as an analyst, but you are seeing, not talking in abstracts, I see it on a regular basis, all these pushes and pulls related to water scarcity.
Well, from my perspective, it's water is just one of those things we look at in the management of the pension fund. So it's just one of those risks, along with a lot of other important risks.
I think you're right that, from my point of view, I went into this on a sustainability basis, not just on water, and women's issues were the ones that drove me to it. But from very, very early on, I began to look at water before, it's been looking at it for a very long time, and there wasn't good metrics and good ways to look at it because of my experience. So yes, it ties in.
Excellent. Well, we have a last word. We can either do a speed round, or if someone wants to summarize what other things we've covered.
I think this will be a very interesting panel to have in a couple of years to see where and how the companies and sectors have had to become more compliant, more rigorous in terms of their water use, and then it translates into better calibration of risk.
What I want to say is that the report itself really is a marker in terms of the kind of information we need in order to become better. So I agree with Dean that it will be interesting to see how it is that we keep on building on this, because it's fascinating.
Well, thank you very much for a very lively and interesting panel. With CDP's indulgence, Dean Sagustin will be back in a few years. And now I'd like to introduce Deb Froedel, Global Executive Director of GE's Eco Imagination. Thank you.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to be here with you from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I have the exciting job of leading GE's growth strategy, Eco Imagination. For those of you not familiar with Eco Imagination, we launched the program back in 2005, and it's our commitment to innovation to create a world that works faster, cleaner, smarter, and better for our customers, our communities, and our planet. So let me start there. Eco Imagination at the core is about helping to transform industries, driving greater efficiency, and improving environmental performance at a scale that is unique to GE. When we launched Eco Imagination back in 2005, GE made public commitments that prioritized clean technology growth, R&D investment, and reductions in our own environmental footprint. By 2015, one of our goals was to reduce our water consumption by 25%. At the end of last year, we had already exceeded that goal and delivered a 46% water consumption reduction, something we're very proud of here at GE. The context of this global water discussion is very important to us at GE. As the population increases, water availability and water security are very important and are becoming an increasing concern in the regions that we work in and operate here at GE. And we are committed to being part of that solution, both for our customers as well as our own operations. So let me start there and share with you a little bit more about our internal strategy. At GE, energy use as well as greenhouse gas emissions are managed by a cross-functional team of experts, including our environmental, engineering, operations, finance, sourcing, and legal organization. They work closely with our colleagues at our GE Global Research Centers to come up with various strategies for us to reduce our water usage. And we do this through new technology introductions, utility sourcing, as well as renewable energy use. GE has a tiered approach when it comes to potential impacts on our operations, and we focus much of our efforts in our manufacturing sites as well as our services operations. These are both overseen by our environmental health and safety policy as well as management system. Locations that consume over 15 million gallons of water annually account for 90% of GE's freshwater use. We examined these sites, identifying the key sites that were in water-scarce regions, and we took a much deeper approach and strategy on what we could do to further reduce our water usage. The strategy has really paid off. As the results are, GE use of freshwater consumed in water-scarce regions has decreased by 2.5% in 2012 versus 2011. Our research center in Bangalore, India is just a great example. The facility underwent an upgrade of the wastewater treatment system. We installed GE water technology and reduced per capita water by 35% between 2006 and 2012. It was a huge win for the facility, but most importantly, in a very water scarce region. We also have engaged our employees to help us reduce and our water strategy. And they are tremendous advocates on the ground that can help us. And we've done this through our Eco-Imagination treasure hunts. The hunts are a discovery process where on-site employees are paired with external experts to investigate energy use and water consumption between sleep mode and shutdown mode. Today, those have identified, qualified, and recommended to minimize waste in the facilities. We have conducted over 300 Eco-Imagination treasure hunts at our facilities already. In addition, we have implemented water Kaizen Blitz events. This idea was initiated by Toyota back in 2009. We've adopted this incremental energy improvement savings model. These workshops are quick workshops to allow us to identify water reduction opportunities, and on average we're finding over 30 to 50% water savings, and with paybacks of less than 2 years. We have conducted over 18 water Kaizen projects at our sites with the most water usage. To even create more incremental value, we have developed a virtual water Kaizen program as well. And a great example of a virtual process that we conducted at our battery center in Schenectady, New York. We were able to reduce the site's projected water by over 80%, save $1 million annually, and the vast majority of this savings honestly comes from GE water membrane technology. So in addition to our own internal efforts, we also are very much aligned with our supply chain, our massive supply chain, and introducing water strategies with them. And it goes beyond much more than just metrics and reporting. We have a systemic approach with the supply chain. In 2012, we included water management and supply and launched a new management tool that really helped our suppliers build a long-term improvement plan around water usage. This year, we enhanced the management tool and also have them reporting out and communicating to us what their comments would be around potential supply risks and what they share with local authorities. So a much more systemic program and engagement with our supply chain. So I've shared with you a little bit about our internal strategy as well as our supply chain strategy, but please make no mistake, we are very much focused on water availability and water quality with our customers as well. So we operate today in 164 countries, and we have unique insights into the local landscape. And we hear from people, both in the public and private sector, on what their needs are. And there are some common themes that we hear repeatedly. They are looking for solutions that save them money, drive productivity, and deliver greater environmental performance, and that is what we are delivering. Besides just manufacturing products that provide clean water, we also have products and services that really are designed to use less water in the operations today. So we're hitting water scarcity really from both sides. Technologies like water purification systems are absolutely critical, but so are water reducing technologies like in our new generation power plants. We have been so successful with innovation and technology because we have a continued commitment and investment in R&D. We have 7 global research centers that have high-end scientists working on technology breakthroughs and big-time innovations that help save customers' productivity, manage to environmental standards, as well as improve both water and energy efficiency. We work on these innovations collectively with our customers to make sure we are bringing to market both optimized and brilliant solutions that we can transcend around the world and develop even for specialized needs in local areas. A great example that we have from technology perspective to offset the environmental impact of natural gas development, GE has a mobile evaporator which treats severely impaired waters that are used in the hydraulic fracturing process. This makes it much more possible to use the water in an industrial processes like hydraulic fracturing, reduce the need for like fresh water, as well as reducing subsequent environmental concerns that may be associated with discharge as well. In water scarce regions, we also have seawater reverse optimization technology, which used to remove salt and dissolved impurities. It's tremendous technology. These units use semi-permeable membranes that create water for both drinking water as well as industrial use water. In closing, through Eco-Imagination, we are helping to transform industries and outcomes for our customers by driving greater efficiency and improving environmental performance. This is core to our values at GE and embedded in our DNA today. We are solving some of the toughest environmental challenges with innovation to help create a world that works faster, cleaner, smarter, and better. We're doing this through our own internal operations, through our supply chain, and through our customers in 164 countries around the world. So thank you so much for listening and allowing me to be part of this great event today. I'm going to turn it back to Kate in New York.
Thank you, Deb. It's really lovely to hear about how you're how GE and other players in the sector are reacting to the pressures of water around the world. There's lots of exciting things there. Thank you for joining us today. As Deb said, my name is Kate Lamb. I am the head of water for CDP, and I'm going to take a few minutes to tell you a bit more about how CDP is reacting to some of these challenges. But first, I'd like to spend a minute or so reminding everybody about why we're here. Now, as I'm sure many of you appreciate, water is the lifeblood of the economy. It creates the element that binds us all together, creating deep and complex interdependencies between companies, communities, and natural ecosystems. And the pressure really is growing for companies to build long-term resilience to water scarcity into their business strategies. As the Chinese proverb states, not only can water float a boat, but it can sink it also. with analysis indicating that there is around $63 trillion worth of at risk by about 2050 as a result of current business as usual water management practices and water productivity. It really is no surprise that CDP's water report this year calls for a step change in water risk management. Water can drive amazing sources of innovative, sustainable growth, but its mismanagement can also lead to significant business failure. As an international not-for-profit, CDP's role really is to push the market beyond where it would otherwise be on environmental issues. And over the past 4 years, we've pioneered the only global system for organizations and cities around the world to report on their water-related information and vital water information to their key stakeholders such as investors and purchasing organizations. Really, it's an opportunity for these companies to report back in a standardized way to their investors, to let them know that they understand the risks that they're facing, but also, more importantly, perhaps, that they're doing something about it. And there really is much to celebrate. Over the last 4 years, the number of investor signatories to the program has quadrupled. We now issue our water questionnaire on behalf of 530 investors with more than $57 trillion worth of assets. In 2013, our questionnaire was issued to more than 1,000 companies, and we've seen a 60% increase in the number of companies disclosing to us this year. We're now almost reaching 600. As a result of that, we now own the world's largest publicly available database of vital water-related information. It spans 112 countries and 91 industry subsectors. And we believe it's a really very valuable resource for many people to rely upon, particularly our investment community. Now, while there are a number of things that we wish to celebrate today, I think while 60% of the global 500 companies did choose to disclose through CDP this year and therefore satisfy their investor expectations, it's important to remember that over 40% failed to satisfy their investor expectations, and they failed to disclose through CDP. As we've heard from a number of speakers, there's still a whole range of challenges. Data comparability is still a little lacking. The disclosure rate is not as high as we would like it to be. So CDP is responding in a whole range of different ways. In 2014, some specific changes that we'll be making is the introduction of a new refined water questionnaire. We spent the last 12 months essentially revisiting every single question and understanding the momentum, the reason for us asking each question. We believe that the questionnaire that we'll be issuing in 2014 will drive greater disclosure, it will drive greater corporate water stewardship, and ultimately provide better, more granular information that you've heard called by from William at NBIM and Joyce today from Rockefeller, and a number of other investors that we've been engaging with who are looking for greater granularity of information alongside more sector-specific approaches. Excitingly, we're also planning to expand our water program. In 2014, we'll be issuing our questionnaire to a range of companies in Japan and in India. And subject to funding, we'll also be issuing our questionnaire in China, Latin America, and Europe in 2015. Another key piece of work that we're working on at the moment and exploring is the development of an investor education platform, a way in which we can better engage and build capacity within the investment community to help them understand the challenges faced by the responding companies, whether that's on a sector-specific basis, a geographic basis. And really, we think this is a wonderful opportunity to help drive better engagement by the investment community and ultimately safeguard water resources. And finally, we'll also be introducing the world's first scoring methodology for water in 2014. Now, in 2014, this methodology will be applied on a private, confidential basis to global 500 responding companies, our supply chain member companies, those that have bought into the water element of our supply chain program, alongside those who are members of our new soon-to-be-released Reporter Services Water Programme. They will all be scored on a confidential basis throughout 2014, and we'll work with them, plus a range of other stakeholders around the world, to refine and ensure that the methodology is as robust as it needs to be. Once that happens, it will then be rolled out across all of the responding companies from 2015 onwards. We believe that the score is really a critical tool in our tool shed. We think it will be a catalyst to drive in greater data comparability and ultimately better water stewardship. For investors, the score will be an indicator of how prepared an organisation is in the face of water challenges. And for the companies, it will be a really useful feedback mechanism for them to understand their situation and positioning within this space. There are a number of other changes underway. If you're interested to hear about them or interested in supporting CDP in any of these endeavours, then please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. At CDP, we do believe that the water challenge that we're all facing can be alleviated. We need a different kind of momentum, however. We need a new way of thinking, and more importantly, we need to act now. Companies need to move efficiently, effectively, and collectively to safeguard water resources in a way that recognises water as a valuable resource and a shared resource at that. We believe that the markets will recognise those companies that take a collaborative approach to water stewardship and safeguard not only the security of the communities and the environment within which they operate, but also safeguard their ability to grow and generate sustainable revenues in the future. I'd like to take this final opportunity to thank everybody again, and to let you know that at CDP, we're really very proud of the leadership position that we've established on water, alongside the other natural capital initiatives that you've heard, including climate change and deforestation. And we look forward to working with those in the room today and a range of other stakeholders in continuing to catalyse the global movement towards a better, more water secure future. I'd like to pass back now to James Cameron in London, who'll provide you with our concluding remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kate, and thank you all of the speakers. And of course, thank you all of those who are online listening. So we've heard about the report today, and we've had discussion around scale and focus and trends. I think it's safe to say, and I'm a proud trustee of CDP, that the report gets bigger and better and more effective and more influential year by year. And just as a way of emphasizing something in the executive summary here, I thought it would be worthwhile just reading out this section. In this report, CDP and Deloitte present results of the analysis based on water disclosures of 184 Global 500 corporations, a 60% response rate. And together, these corporations account for approximately 11 billion megalitres of water withdrawals per year, enough to provide 50 litres of water per day to the world's current population of approximately 7 billion people for 82 years. Now, that's a substantial contribution to the lifeblood of the economy, as Kate says. We've also heard, of course, that the way we manage water today produces risks, sometimes risks that are not well managed and are not linear in character. But as we also know, that opens up tremendous opportunity, and we've seen some extremely good examples of how companies are managing risk and finding opportunity, including, of course, in new technologies and business practices. Some of the concepts that we've been working with today that I think will be significant parts of the business language in the future ahead are water stewardship, how it's necessary to find new ways of collaborating, different sorts of partnerships, different ways of combining interests in order to safeguard resources that we need in order to thrive and prosper. We've heard about virtual water, the vital connection between water and critical trading routes between countries, geopolitical forces, but also the need to think about commodities in a way that is connected to where the water comes from to enable them to be traded in the first place and the risks associated with them not being managed effectively. That in turn has led to conversation about conflict and political risk associated with the mismanagement or poor distribution of water. We've also heard not to get overexcited about some global price for water, but think more about value and the way in which value is created or destroyed by the way water is managed. To think of ways in which to build value into our economic system for water. The vital connection between energy, water, and carbon has been established, and in many instances we now know that it's possible to manage these three together in ways that are productive and profitable. The example that we've heard from GE about the tremendous technological innovations that are available to better use water profitably and to find ways of meeting really quite demanding targets in the corporate world in a relatively short period of time with very little cost or relatively low levels of cost. But all of that has required us to think very deeply about what it is we measure, how it is that we build metrics that are helpful to decision making. We all remember, those of us who were there, President Clinton using a famous phrase that has been helpful to CDP, I think, ever since, which is that when you have a very complex problem with multiple dimensions and is hugely dispersed across time and space, what you absolutely must do is have something to measure progress with. In his own words, you've got to keep score. And if you are convinced, and I think it is a convincing narrative, that water is the lifeblood of the economy, then it's obvious that it needs to be monitored, it needs to be checked in a way that allows its health to be improved, and you have to have reliable and dependable metrics for doing that. Now, it's hoped that this work that's underway now for several years at CDP provides, at the very least, a very good beginning for how that process should operate, so that we have a good idea of what the best metrics are for decision making, whether it's in the investor community or within corporations or in governments at very many levels, including at the city level. But we also hope that this conversation that's underway will help us to improve, to learn better, and to establish a conversational link that unites many different actors around the world, so that the true value of this vital resource is reflected in the millions of decisions that get made every day that affect the vitality of our natural systems. So in coming to conclusion now at the end of a very good conversation, it gives me great pleasure to pass over to Paul Dickinson so that he can conclude with thank yous and a goodbye. And I'll just simply say well done to all those involved. The technology worked, and we are all connected in this conversation. Let's keep going. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. And once again, do recognise the carbon emissions that are saved by conducting a global meeting on this particular basis with these technologies, which I am very fond of personally. I do want to thank very much our distinguished speakers for your insights today. They're very greatly appreciated. What we're doing here is we're calling on investors to lead a charge, if you will, to encourage companies participating in CDP on the path towards water stewardship. And I remember speaking a few years ago at our first water launch, and we live in countries where water is somewhat taken for granted. But I had benefited, or I should say suffered, from a dream in which there was no water. And I can tell you I felt what that might be like. Even as someone who spent his life in OECD cities, it doesn't take you very long to see that water is a pretty serious issue for those who don't have it. Now, a final thought really from me is about the role of the corporation. Notice the corporation is the dominant and the most successful institution in the latter part of the 20th century, and indeed most certainly in the 21st century. And we see increasingly governments talking about a business case for this or that. If you look back to Burleigh and Means, they wrote in 1932 in their Modern Corporation and Private Property, they foresaw a time where corporations would perhaps be more influential than states. If we think about the implication of globalization, the political implication of globalization, I think we've arrived at a point whereby the modern corporation is of a critical importance in achievement of sustainability. And indeed, I personally would argue sustainability is the name we give to problems the government can't fix. At least they can't fix alone. So this is a unique time in the development of the corporation where huge economic opportunities stand available in terms of water stewardship. But also there's an imperative for our societies in the rich and the developing nations, both to manage this scarce resource against the background of rising populations. So let me conclude by thanking you all very much for your time and reminding you that the report based on these findings, a brilliant report written by Deloitte, is available for download from cdp.net. free of charge, and also the responses from the corporations, which are also available free of charge, many of those corporations having reported through CDP now for 4 years. Clearly, we're on a journey. It's been a great pleasure to share it with you today. And please let me conclude on behalf of all at CDP, and thank you for your time today. Goodbye.